Welcome everyone. Welcome to the second of our summer term What If debates. We always just have to cover the housekeeping matters first. So for those of you who like to tweet, hopefully you've seen the posters and flyers around the room with the Wi-Fi code and login instructions. The hashtag is #IOE Debates, all one word. And those watching via the live stream can submit questions for the panel via that hashtag. Now, we're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, we'll take the doors behind you out onto Bedford Way. And as some of you may know, we're running this event series in association with the TES, and this particular debate links in with the special issue the TES published on the 4th of May on the 40th anniversary of the Warnock Report. So my thanks to TES's John Severs and the IOE's Rob Webster for their help in shaping tonight's event. Now, Mary Warnock's 1978 report was hugely significant for how we as a society thought about the education of children with special needs. And a lot has changed since then. Within the school system, there are the effects of competition and accountability, and more widely, there's been an increase in the proportion of children with special needs and the severity of those needs. In public policy, we've seen a switch away from a bias towards inclusion. No doubt there's been progress since the 1970s. But Mary Warnock has herself questioned how her committee's recommendations played out in practice. Meanwhile, schools and the families of children with special needs are increasingly talking about a crisis in the system. So, is now the time for another inquiry on the scale of the Warnock inquiry? And if so, what might it recommend so that we can make better progress for all? And to help us reflect on those questions, we have Tara Flood, disability rights activist and, since 2006, director of the Alliance for Inclusive Education, otherwise known as ELFI. ELFI campaigns for the rights of all disabled pupils and students, including those with SEN, to be included in mainstream education. At an international level, Tara has also been closely involved in the development of the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and is now working to get the convention fully implemented. Sally Phillips, award-winning writer and actor and mother of 3, including Ollie, who has Down syndrome. You'll know Sally from her roles in Smack the Pony, Miranda, and Bridget Jones, among others. In 2016, Sally co-wrote and presented the award-winning BBC documentary A World Without Down Syndrome, ? Which has subsequently been screened around the world, generating debate about prenatal screening practices and the wider attitudes towards disability that they're closely entwined with. Vegeta Patel, principal of Swiss Cottage School and Development and Research Centre, a special needs school for children aged 2 to 19 in Camden, so on our doorstep. Swiss Cottage School is a national teaching school, and Vegeta herself is a national leader of education, meaning that they each have a regional and a national role in supporting school improvement in the sector. Swiss Cottage has had 6 consecutive outstanding Ofsted inspections, being just one of 8 schools nationally to have done so. And Klaus Wedel, an educational psychologist who was appointed in 1979 to the first chair in special education at the IOE. Klaus participated in 2 post-Warnock SEND reviews, the first for the National Children's Bureau in 1984, and then for the Inner London Education Authority in 1985. In 1995, on his retirement, he co-founded the National Senko Forum and an electronic support network. He's currently the special needs governor for his village school and helps as a part-time voluntary teaching assistant. Now, before we hear from our esteemed panelists, a few weeks ago we spoke to Baroness Warnock herself. or our colleague Rob did. And you can watch the full interview on our event webpage. But for this evening, we've picked out just a few minutes to help set the scene, so some highlights of the interview that will be covering why the Warnock inquiry was launched, the realities of statementing in practice, the prospects for its replacement, education, health and care plans, and what any future SEND inquiry should focus on. So we're going to see those few clips now. Thanks, Tom.
The reason why Margaret Thatcher set up this committee as Secretary of State for Education was simply because the law had changed, and now suddenly all children were going to go to school. And so she thought rightly that the whole situation therefore needed to be rethought. I think far the most positive legacy was one that actually was very, very difficult to get across to people at the time. It was not so much that we were going to bring in a whole lot of children who hadn't been in the classroom before, though that was part of it, of course. It was also, we were trying to point out that there already were these children in the classroom whom teachers must realise did have special needs. And that was part of, a large part of what we meant by inclusion. Statementing had become entirely a matter of trying to get extra money. So the whole issue of what the child actually needed, which was meant to go into the statement, had got sort of slurred over, and the statement became really just a matter of what little bit of money extra people thought they could screw out of government. The greatest difficulty that my committee had was to devise a way in which social workers, doctors and teachers could talk to one another about the needs of the child, because all of them, in many cases, most cases, all of them had something to contribute. But it was the most difficult thing in the world, and to bring them together. And we didn't solve that problem. So in that way, I think our report might as well never have been written. And so I was cynical when this great new idea of the doctors and the social workers and the teachers all sitting around the table making this wonderful plan. I knew it wasn't going to happen, because in fact it was the teachers always who drew up the plan, who do now draw up the plan, and therefore the emphasis is still entirely on education and not on either medicine or social needs. Again, thinking of the autistic and people on the autistic spectrum, Asperger's children as well, they really cannot put up with a large class and a large playground. And I really think there's unanimity that the autistic child does need a special school, and there they can, many of them, flourish. Well, I believe that it should focus on teacher training. And I know that teachers probably think that I'm extraordinarily demanding what I think they ought to do, but I really do believe that teachers must be trained in their attitude towards the pupils in their class. If somehow one's got to get teachers who realise that their job is enormously important, but it isn't a matter of conveying information to their pupils, it's a matter of loving them, quite frankly. Loving their pupils is what the teacher has to be trained to do, and then they'll see, as they go along, who's floundering, who's in difficulties, who really does need a bit of extra help, even quite a little bit of extra help. And I think this is what should be the core of teacher training, and I'm not sure that it is.
Baroness Warnock, thank you very much for talking to us.
listening. And so really responding and building on that, over to our panellists, and we're going to start with Tara. Thanks, Tara.
Thanks, Becky. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. All right. I'll drag this a bit closer. Great, thanks very much. Yeah, so my name's Tara Flood. I'm a director at ALFI. And I just want to start by just sort of reflecting really that I think 40 years ago, the idea that disabled children and young people could ever be included in mainstream education was really radical. So Baroness Warnock at the time was really setting out quite a radical vision. There were some people nowadays who still think that was quite a radical idea. But 40 years on, I think we're at a crossroads or a cliff face. Because I think what I can see, and I think a lot of people can see, is a rowing back of much of the progress that has been made over the last 40 years. The reality is that much of the good intention and the aspiration for inclusion has been dismantled by not just this government, but previous governments, where the ideology, and Becky raised this point, has been much more about education in terms of elitism, competition and academic results. It's an ideology that is utterly counter to the government's own commitment to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and Article 24, the right to inclusive education. Personally, 40 years ago, I, like so many other disabled children, was in a residential special school. And I was there for the whole of my childhood, separated from my family, separated from my community, whilst the system did everything it possibly could to normalise me. I'm delighted to say they were singularly unsuccessful. Who needs to be normal? But the question is whether or not Warnock's vision has been successful. I think to a degree that it has. There are certainly more disabled children in mainstream school than if Warnock hadn't happened. But is it really inclusion? Again, for some, I think it is, but the practice and the policy changes coming out of Warnock still saw disabled children and young people as the problem to be fixed. I should say, when I talk about disabled children and young people, I'm also including in that young people with labels of special educational needs. And as we know, about 12 years ago, Baroness Warnock published an update on her earlier work for the Conservative Party in the run-up to the 2010 general election. It was often described, probably still is, as a U-turn, her U-turn on inclusion. But again, I'd question whether or not it was. What she found was that disabled pupils and students were being let down by a one-size-fits-all education system. Schools lacking resources, teachers under enormous pressure to deliver unrealistic targets, parents struggling to find places for their children in local schools, and then children and young people having their creativity restricted by an unimaginative curriculum and deeply inflexible assessments and accreditation systems. I have to say, it doesn't feel like a great deal has changed in the last 12 years, but I would say I think that things have actually got a great deal worse if we throw austerity into the mix. Sadly for me, Warnock didn't talk about rights. She talked about needs, special educational needs. I think she also failed to recognise the difference between integration and inclusion. Integration is where disabled pupils and students, including those with SEN, are placed in mainstream schools and colleges with some adaptation, some additional resources, but on the condition that they fit in with pre-existing structures, attitudes, and in an unaltered environment. I think that sounds familiar too. That feels like the education system we have now. Inclusion, I think, is much more about system change, about the removal of all barriers to the full participation of every child, and that every child is considered to be a unique and valued individual. So for me, integration doesn't work for all pupils, but inclusion can. And that said, there are many schools around the country who are bucking the trend, who are including disabled children with a range of labels, usually including profound, multiple and complex. Eastleigh School in Newham, Emerson's Green in Bristol, Blatchington Mill in Brighton, amongst others. We have a presumption for mainstream principle, as I'm sure everyone here knows. But what does that mean? It's better to have it than not have it, but in many respects, the principle really just supports children to get through the door of an education setting. It doesn't say much at all about what happens once the child is through the door. And even with that principle and government rhetoric around parental choice, we have an education system that for some disabled children really is inherently biased towards special schools. Parental choice, hang on a second, parental choice is only a reality, I think, if parents agree to what's on offer. And I think if parents challenge either the local authority or the school, they are really almost certainly facing a difficult and lengthy and usually jolly expensive legal battle. So government rhetoric also talks about children having a good education. But again, for disabled children, what does that mean? Essentially, the value lies very much with children that can learn in a standardised way and can add value to a school, particularly their academic indicators, by producing good SATs and good GCSE results. Those children that can't access testing and assessment regimes are increasingly surplus to requirements. The education system in the UK, I think, is anything but child-focused. Children have become the fuel that stokes the furnace of competition between schools, and I don't blame schools for that. I blame a government that refuses to see the value in all children. And what's the evidence? Well, disabled children are disproportionately represented in the school exclusion statistics, and disabled children are increasingly disappearing from mainstream education. You'll be delighted to know, however, despite that doom and gloom, I do think there are some positives out there. There are schools bucking the trend, I've already talked about that, but there are also parents coming together at the local level to challenge the huge cuts that there have been in local SEN support services. And for me personally, the icing on the cake was the UN Disability Committee last summer that was scrutinising the UK government's implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Their concluding observations document highlighted that the UK government's current approach to disabled people, including children, is causing a human catastrophe. The phone calls that Alfie receives on a daily basis absolutely confirm that to be true. The committee have set out, I've got a red light flashing, bear with me. The committee have set out a number of really good recommendations, very practical, and I think the government needs to think much more carefully how they make those recommendations a reality for all children. I'm going to finish by quoting a gorgeous parent that we know who has an even more gorgeous young man making that very difficult transition from primary to secondary school. And she talks about inclusion. She talks about inclusion being talked about a lot, especially when a box needs to be ticked. Inclusion for me means so much more than that. It means equality, and it means a sense of belonging, value, and humanity. My son has all sorts of labels that means he requires additional support to learn. He's not going to be able to access GCSEs, and so we're struggling to find him a mainstream place that will accept him. My son is not going to be an academic high achiever, but he needs and deserves a good education. He also needs and has a right to be part of the world, have friends and feel part of his community. We want him to be part of mainstream world, not separated out because he can't perform well in tests. To me, inclusion is about everybody and it benefits everybody. Do we really need to continue to compartmentalise children by their ability to take tests? Inclusive education is about there being no excuses for not including every child, disabled or non-disabled. Accept the fact and work with it. Thank you.
Tara, thank you so much. Vegeta.
I wanted to start by taking us into the shoes of three different students. Pupil A, primary school is mainstream. Secondary school, parents fight to keep him in mainstream. Asperger's syndrome, but very high cognitive abilities. Gains GCSEs, gains A levels, goes on to get a master's degree in statistics. But the Asperger's means that he has challenges with social interaction, eye contact, basic cues. He is still trying to secure his job, and he is now 26 years old, though he has much to offer. Pupil B, primary school is mainstream. And then there's discovery of a degenerative condition. So she is placed in a secondary special school. And during her time there, the regression is very, very fast at its pace. So develops mobility challenges, is developing communication disorders, and is also becoming very dependent on adult support. Through parental sort of push to ensure the independence, she continued to achieve her GCSEs, get some functional skills qualifications as well, and use an electronic wheelchair successfully so that she was not dependent on the adults in that school. She has transitioned to FE, but then has fallen into the vicious cycle, which is essentially supported development with internships in social care. And then pupil C, primary school was mainstream, excluded, so transitioned to a secondary special school after being at an alternative provision. Classic EBD, now SCMH, very successful because it was a wraparound provision, a lot of counselors on site, gained GCSEs with functional skills as well, managed to finish at the age of 19. Unfortunately, then the cliff edge was there and is in prison. So 3 students for us to wear a lens with as we think about the national statistics for England, because in a way we're exploring the potential of the new dawn through this debate. So out of the over 8.6 million children and young people in this country, we know that over 1.2 million are identified with special educational needs and or disabilities by professionals. The majority, 92%, are in mainstream. 8% will be in specialist provisions or special schools. Schools are navigating a range of reforms. So if we think about just the last 5 years, 2014, new SEND reforms, we get a new national curriculum. 2015 sees us interacting with new secondary assessments with Progress 8 and Attainment 8. 2015, we're engaging with assessment without levels, then the Rochford Review. We get the Rochford Report, then we're interacting with the primary assessment consultation. That is a lot to navigate, whilst recognizing that at the heart of that is this new generation of pupils with special educational needs. But with all those reforms are opportunities. For me, I came across a very important article in The Guardian in 2016, written by a head teacher named Jarlath O'Brien, where he put a very important magnifying glass on the exclusion stats for pupils with special educational needs. Half of all permanent and fixed-term exclusions are for pupils with SEN. Pupils with SEN support had the highest permanent exclusion rate and were 7 times more likely to receive a permanent exclusion than a pupil without SEN. Pupils with a statement or EHCP were 7 times more likely to receive a fixed period exclusion than pupils with no SEN. And those were pupils who had a lot of wraparound paperwork defining what they needed, what their support should be, but still were stuck on this sort of predestined outcome. MenCap has highlighted to us stats about employment that I feel reflect that sort of conveyor belt situation. Only 17% of all working age people with a learning disability have a paid job. 28% being adults with mild or moderate learning difficulties. 10% for working adults with severe learning difficulties. Scope has highlighted that disabled people are twice as likely to be unemployed as non-disabled peers. But I think what we need to do is find the opportunity that's sitting underneath this current climate. And what we have growing underneath the reforms and those years of statistics is a school-led system. It's been 13 years since teaching schools were developed. And today, after those 13 years, we have 800 teaching schools across this country. Those are partnerships of schools working together in order to shape a school-led system. 94 of those are teaching school alliances led by special schools. And they're working in partnership not with other special schools, but with mainstream primary and secondary schools. It's a recognition that it's not about being the island, it's actually about sharing a collective responsibility and really tackling the dilemma around inclusion, engaging with what that definition means, but also taking those reforms and the opportunities that sit within them to shape how those reforms are going to go into action into our schools on the front line. Every designated teaching school has a responsibility for initial teacher training, professional development, and school-to-school support. And what I think is fantastic is that we're able to reflect a shared responsibility towards not just outcomes for pupils, but for cultural change and for the values that need to be sitting in a very inclusive environment, which is going to be the stepping stone into the world of employment. The SALT review in 2010 and the Children's Commissioner's report in 2013 both highlighted the potential in meaningful teacher training, shaping what would be a capacity and workforce that is going to change not just how to meet children's needs, but how to grow the society that is accepting, not tolerating. Very importantly for me, what I feel should be coupled with that, which I'm going to say in 30 seconds, is the potential of employment linked to it. So if there was a responsibility for corporations, for employers to hold a social responsibility with schools, to make sure that that bridge is there and is not a cliff edge, what we could see is the potential of a richer and more effective approach to taking the learning of what individualized provision can be and ensuring that employers and corporations understand what promoting inclusive cultures in their own workforce is going to look like. If we start from the employers and come backwards, what we're doing is helping them understand how workforces need to look flexible, how it is going to be involving acceptance of how the workforce looks different, understanding that where our classrooms don't look the same, jobs don't need to look the same as well, being able to recognize that there's a need for employment programs which are recognizing what can work for pupils, not what they cannot do, and through that, an exploration of what qualifications can look alternatively, so that at the point of application, pupils are not destined to not make it through an HR program because they do not have the qualifications necessary to get the role. For those pupils, pupil A, pupil B, and pupil C, the golden thread across all of them was that they flourished in the provisions that understood what they could do, tried to respond to their point of learning, and help take them to where their potential was. If employment was able to wrap itself around that understanding which sits very carefully in the heart of schools, then it's really the potential of how we can make sure those pupils are continuing on to their pathway into adulthood and be a part of the workforce, which is going to reflect a society that is accepting and reflecting what a sort of inclusive society should be.
Vegeta, thank you. Klaus.
Right. I've been given 5 minutes, as all of us have, and since I've been working in this area for 60 years, I reckon I wouldn't be able to keep to it unless I actually wrote down what I was going to say. So excuse me if I'm going to read my contribution. And we've been given really 3 questions. The first question is about the significance of the Warnock Committee's report. For me, the report captured the development of thinking and legislation in the 2 preceding decades among parents and professionals, and also in the light of research findings. The report rightly presents this development as representing a paradigm shift from the previous educable-ineducable dichotomy by stating that all these children and young people have a right to education. Educational measures have to be matched to their difficulties and disabilities. Special educational needs is an appropriate terminology, which was actually invented by Professor Gulliford in 1970. Special educational needs can be seen as occurring across a continuum of degrees of severity, resulting from the interaction between the difficulties and disabilities and the impact of the educational measures provided. The committee's report, of course, goes on to investigate a whole lot of other points, but that for me is the main crux of what it offered. The second question asks, how far have we come in the last 40 years? And I have a list here which is actually already been to some extent presented by my colleagues here. And I just want to refer to a brief list of positive and negative indicators. There have clearly been improvements in making the mainstream education systems more responsive to individual learning needs and disabilities, and in the further professional development of teachers and particularly of SENCOs in helping to personalize support. So next, however, incompatible accountability demands have been placed on teachers and schools, as already been mentioned. On the one hand, there is a demand for achieving standards in the national curriculum, and I'm now got a nice musical background to this. So I'm sorry if I'm cutting across the music. However, the next point I wanted to make is this incompatible accountability demands that have been placed on teachers and schools. On the one hand, there is the demand for achieving standards in the national curriculum, and on the other, the explicit special needs demands to enable pupil progress in the broader curriculum aims and concerned with pupils' individual development and social achievement. But as been mentioned, nonetheless, there are individual schools which have prioritized and outstanding special needs provision. Then there's primary legislation in the form of the 1981 Act and related acts, and they represent attempts to match special needs policies and practices with varying degrees of success. And so far, it's taken 3 revisions of the codes of practice. The next one is the right of children and young people and their families to participate in decision-making about provision. And that's become an increasingly recognized importance. Attempts continue to integrate the education, health, and social services and the third sector contributions. Furthermore, changes in the structure of the education system and the reduction in local authorities' capacities have led to a fragmentation of special educational provision. Next, funding arrangements for mainstream and special support provision have varied in their achievement of strategic economies of scale and cost effectiveness. But the arrangements have deteriorated under the current austerity regime, as already been mentioned. A massive increase in research at a worldwide level has continued, and of course this Institute of Education is making a major contribution to that. So in summary, it's probably fair to say that the majority of this list identifies developments over the last 40 years and they've led to greater possibilities for inclusive education. However, some have either shown a lack of improvement or have even impeded it. So the last question asks, where do we go from here? And it's already been mentioned that the very nature of the general educational system in its current form prevents dilemmas about inclusion. If we leave children and young people in mainstream provision, we have difficulty in fitting in adequate support for their individual needs. If we separate them out to enable them to have access to specialist provision, we jeopardize inclusion. Patching up attempts have been made, for example, by the requirement for schools to appoint SENCOs and to reduce the system's barriers to pupil progress. And this has become very clear from the National SENCO Forum. Plenty of criticism already has been leveled at the limited relevance to the 21st century demands of the current general education system itself. So is it time for a paradigm shift in our present situation? 2018 marks 25 years since the 1993 report of the National Commission on Education, which looked at the need for developments in the subsequent 25 years. So that's 25 years ago this year. I was asked to contribute the chapter on special educational needs in 1993, and I wrote, "Seen from 25 years on, it will seem incredible that we did not use the scope for organizational and pedagogic flexibility which already exists to respond to the demands of the broad and balanced curriculum and pupils' learning needs." So my question on this last one, where do we go from here, is why have we not taken this question seriously?
Klaus, thank you very much. And Sally.
Hi. I sit before you, lightly stinking, in my silk shirt, as an example of what happens to relatively sane people when they have to deal with the ECHP process. The dog ate my speech. It's not quite finished. I'm feeling like I haven't understood quite a lot of what's gone on. So if you will forgive me, I know that anecdotes aren't data and all the rest of it. I will just give you what I have, which I hope will be entertaining, if not enlightening. So the question that I was asked was, what still needs to be done? And when I look back at the notes, what still needs to be done? I committed mime harakiri and lay on the floor for about a minute, even though I was alone. And then I got up and I read that again, and I blew my brains out with an air pistol, and then I ate a whole basket of slightly stale Easter eggs. What I say to you is that I think that what really needs to be done is everything needs to be burnt to the ground, and we need to start again. I just don't think it's working. I think our units of measure, I think we're measuring everything. Why are we measuring absolutely everything? And for my child anyway, the units of measure are all wrong. There's so many examples, but Ollie scores, 0 on all the tests. That IQ, his IQ seems to vary wildly from year on year. That shouldn't really happen. It's something about the tests. With SATs, he's not allowed to be helped, so he can't do the first question, but he can do numbers 2 to 6. None of the reports measure his actual attainment. So how can we tell where he should be? How can we tell where the right place for him to be is? How can schools tell each other about my child? Because there's no unit of measure that accurately describes him. Similarly, we're noticing an increase in the medical model of disability in schools. My friend is a speech and language therapist. She goes into a primary school in Banbury, where all children that present with special needs are now sent to the paediatrician and are given a DNA sequenced. So they're sent to the paediatrician because they're presenting with symptoms of autism, and the paediatrician then DNA sequences them at the cost of £450 in an era of austerity, and comes back and says, "Oh, there's a long arm on chromosome 20. That might be contingent with autism." And they go, "I know that. That's why I sent him to you. This is 450 quid. We really could have spent on, laminating." The centre forms, they sounded so hopeful at the time, but 3 years later, ECHPs remain unwritten. LA's never replied to emails. I am really admin challenged. Sam Silver can confirm that. I'm frightened of post offices, actually. And I just don't think in a linear way. I sort of think in like popcorn going off. And I wrote 10 emails to the LA with no reply. I had to go in, and they chased someone around a desk. The Senkos are drowning, obviously, and this idea of putting the families at the centre, yes, great in theory, but my to-do list is about 125 points long, and about 85 of those are to do with Ollie's education. I can't manage. I just can't do it. I'm not alone. There's endless chasing and checking and report writing. And now, the insult, we're being asked to input to government consultations. And so not only do I have to write endless reports for my son, but I also have to now reply to government, if any of us get time after we've come back from tribunal and 3 visits to the paediatrician. And how on earth do I find a podiatrist for my son? What on earth is that toenail doing? And, all of these things. It's so decimating that one might even accidentally say yes to a debate about inclusion in the Institute of Education, because at first sight it looked like it was another meeting with the deputy head about whether or not my child would be allowed back after exclusion number 15, which was for calling Mr. Myton a lardhead. It's so hard, and it just doesn't need to be. This is a human rights issue. I don't like us talking about the ideology of inclusion, because to me that makes it sound like it's optional or personal. I think we're talking about human rights. These are human rights. These are non-negotiable. They're not special needs. They're actual needs. They're needs everybody has. Everybody has a need to be included in their society and to be educated. The example for Down syndrome, I know Barney knows a bit about this, but I'm a mother of a child with Down syndrome. Children with Down syndrome do better in mainstream. This is unequivocally proven. We've been asking the same question for over 20 years. We've had the same results in studies, small and large, in the UK and all over the world. Children with Down syndrome who attend mainstream school leave with better spoken language, better reading ability, and better academic attainment than those in special school. Sue Buckley's most recent research also shows no difference in behaviour and self-help skills, and no difference in social inclusion and friendships until after the age of 17. As long as they're properly supported, that's the key, with modelling, support, and planning for friendships in and out of school. In the Netherlands, Gert de Graaf did a large study in 2016, which actually shows that the average IQ of somebody with Down syndrome is 50, and so those above have greater than average intelligence, those under less than average intelligence. Sorry, I lost my place. They found that those with IQs below 50, in the 35 to 50 range, who attended mainstream school, attained better results than those with the higher IQ who went to special. You know, of course, special has its place, but the main reasons for this higher attainment seem to be higher expectations, peer role models, and the fact that in mainstream school they get between 1.5 to 2 times more academic tuition per week. And the results are, you know, better social acceptance, better self-esteem, and more integrated society. I think the results are far-reaching. I mean, we see, I met this woman, Finnish woman, who had a positive antenatal result for Down syndrome, and I said, what are you going to do? And she said, I'll keep it. She said, in Finland, we're all educated together, so I have lots of friends with Down syndrome. Plus, she said, Finnish women are strong. And I thought that was just, you know, incredibly significant. If we know each other, we know our neighbours, we think of them as human beings. Who knows what kind of impact that will have on society of the future, as we are, you know, every woman in the future is going to have to be a geneticist, because we can already DNA sequence the entire genome in the womb. You know, the choices young women are going to be given in the future are mind-boggling. How can you make a decision? What is informed choice if you don't know what the other is? And we seem to have a society that is, you know, I agree that we are moving away from inclusion. We're building more and more walls. And what was the stat I read? That the DFE project the special school population will rise by 14% by 2026, an extra 13,000 pupils. We're pushing more and more people out. And I think this, again, is a result of all the measuring. Like the minute you start measuring, you create a mean. And once you create a mean, you put the objective as the mean. Since when were British people trying to be average? Right? We're eccentric and brilliant and weird, and, you know, we live with penguins, and, you know, I don't know why I said live with penguins. Is it telling me to stop now? It's a stop. I'll stop. I think that's best.
Thank you so much, panel. I mean, that's been enormously stimulating, and I know that the audience is going to have a lot of questions. I mean, I suppose that a key question that's coming up again and again, both from Mary Warnock's film, but from your talk as well, is this question about pupils' needs, you know, the kids' needs, not those of the school, but whether those kids, whether those needs can and should be incorporated and provided for within mainstream. You've all alluded slightly differently to sort of, you know, different situations and with concern about the trends that we might be seeing. But can I ask you all to just give us a sentence or two on what you think the parameters are here?
Do you want me to go first, please? I think it's back to the needs, isn't it? It's the point I made about the distinction between rights and needs, and Sally's just made it. If we believe fundamentally that every child or young person has a right to be in a mainstream school, then we just work out how that's going to be. We just get on and do it. Teachers get the right support, parents get the right support to make that decision with confidence. But more importantly, young people get the support they need to feel that whatever they're contributing, whatever progress they make is important, and it's not judged against a normative standard, which for lots of young people, whether they have a label or not, is unachievable. So in a sense, we're setting children up to feel failure really at a very early age. And is there any wonder then that we have a huge spike in young people experiencing mental health issues with very little support for them to be able to manage that? And then suddenly they're out of education and they're into PRUs and they're into alternative provision and ultimately they're into youth justice. And God, I sound like the doom-monger, apologies. But I'll go back to my first point, which is that if we just agree that the mainstream education system with a significant amount of capacity building. I am not saying that inclusion is possible in the current education system because it's so fundamentally wrong for so many children that it's impossible for it to happen. And I really like the idea of setting a box of matches to the education system, and that's not going to happen. But we could think much more broadly about what the purpose of education is and what we want young people to feel when they're leaving education and moving into the world as kind of like, well, as adults now, given the school leaving age is 18. So, of course, it's absolutely possible.
Vegeta, obviously you're representing a very acclaimed, long-standing special school. Tell us about sort of some of the, your perspective on this.
I think crucially, the threshold should not be something that is a fixed boundary. It's a Venn diagram, and it's about connectivity. We work with a lot of mainstream primary and special schools. We also work with a lot of third sector organizations and specialist provisions that are meeting the needs of highly complex profiles. And what I can very confidently say is with the colleagues that we work with locally, but also those we have supported regionally and nationally, there is very much a push to make sure that the needs of the individual are driving what some of those partnerships are. And very importantly, it is about peer relationships. It's not about pupils being stuck in a specialist provision for the entirety of their education. They may be placed at a school like ours, but the very creative provisions are actually ensuring that pedagogy is driving what is going to be taking place for the partnerships as well. So I think it's really important that the parameters are not fixed, and actually everyone has their best practice and their passions and what that provision is doing exceptionally well. I have worked with incredible mainstream schools that actually work very closely with other special schools in a way that wouldn't have been intended. It came out of a partnership that was equal. There was no hierarchy. It wasn't about need. It was actually about a joint interest. And what's come out of that is pretty incredible and actually benefits the pupils recognizing what society actually is, not that it's about you're type A, we're type B, and we've got to try to work and coexist.
Thanks, Vegeta. Sally, you wanted to come in, I think.
Oh, it's just all gone. No, I mean, no, it's just interesting factoid that in the 80s, the Italian government just went, separate schools are wrong. Let's make them all let's get them all on the same sites. Let's include everybody. And it was a bit chaotic, but they did it over a summer. Like, shut all the schools, open them up. And for me, I do recognise, especially my autistic friends who have sensory, but I do think that if you put a sensory, I really love easy read scripts. I get, the MenCap easy read, treat me well stuff. I find it much easier to read the easy read stuff. I took it all in, took it in better. I'm sure that if the classrooms adapted, the teaching adapted for, a friend of mine who taught Shakespeare to a class that had a child with Down syndrome in, the whole class did better when it was adapted. So I do love the idea of porous. I'm so encouraged to hear Vegeta talking like that because I think that's what we need both ways. We need the doors open, but ideally, people on the same site so that the kids can all know each other. We can know each other and be known. It just seems such a fundamentally important thing because we teach children what our society is through school. That's really where we do it. At home I can teach them the strange things, but at school they need to learn how society actually works.
Klaus, did you have anything to add?
Yes, needless to say, I do. In the sense that I think one of the points that Tara has made, and Sally too, is, as I said in my comment 25 years ago, why actually have we not in mainstream achieved the levels that in fact could be achieved from the existing knowledge that exists now about methodology, about the whole business of having a school that interestingly emphasizes something that I don't know that came out in Mary's interview. At one point she says that cherishes children. We did a big research project here on what worked in mainstream schools for children with moderate learning difficulties. What came out was the obvious one, which was it depends upon whether the school valued the individual child and to what extent they did something about it. I mean, one of the questions that has really come up from all of our discussion is why are mainstream schools not facilitated to be able to be more inclusive? And it's to some extent because presumably you can't die of bad education. If this was a hospital, as we're hearing about the health service now, there would be an inquiry straight away. And we are not seeing mainstream education as something that is as critical and requires the kind of insights that Vegeta has been talking about. I think obviously even on the way to something like this, we have to recognize that some special schools have a degree of expertise that makes all the difference for the individual child. One of the things, I gave evidence to the Warnock Committee on behalf of the British Psychological Society and education psychologists, and parents said, the parent chair, a very authoritative lady called Mrs. Chumin, I shall never forget her, said, who is your client? Is it the local authority, your employer, or is it you as a professional? And I think I was able to say, without any contradiction, that as professionals we were concerned with what were the needs of the child, not with whether the local authority had enough of a high needs grant to be able to cover that particular problem.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, that's very helpful. We'll turn it over to you, the audience, now. Because of the film input, we're going to run over about 5 minutes beyond our usual 7 o'clock finish. So I hope that you can all stay till the end, and we won't keep it longer than that because I know many of you will have had trains booked and so on, but it'll give you a good chance to ask your questions. So as usual, we'll take a few at a time if there are enough hands up, and I'm seeing a couple shooting up straight away. So we had the gentleman in the middle first of all, and we'll, for convenience, we'll then do the lady on the edge and the lady here.
Thank you. Jarlath O'Brien. Professor Gert Biester said when children become a liability for their school's performance, education has come to an end, which sounds quite apocalyptic, but is, for me, sadly reminiscent of where we are at the minute. And Sally, you mentioned progress. For Ollie and Klaus, you talked about frustration about the last 25 years. We haven't yet talked about a system of performativity and hyper-accountability that we sit in at the minute. It's a sad fact that, for some children are more desirable to have on the school roll than others, potentially maybe biddable high attainers, and some children are a risk to have on the roll than others. And that's a sad situation about where we are. What do the panel think we could do about the system of measuring progress, performance of schools, that means that children cease to be a risk to have on their roll?
Thank you very much. And there's a question here. Sorry.
Hi, my name's Jane Noy. I'm a Senko, and I completely agree with everything that everyone has been saying about the impact of austerity, the high stakes in our education system, and I would just say that from the parents in my school, everything at the moment just seems to be a real battle to get what they need for their children, and obviously for Senkos as well, it's a real battle to get what we need for our children. So really my question to the panel is, obviously there's a massive overhaul that needs to happen, and burn everything down and start from the bottom, I think sounds like a great idea. But what can I do as a Senko tomorrow to support the children in my school and support the parents?
Thank you, lovely question. And there was one just further along your row.
Hi, I'm an English teacher, and I've just, last year, students that graduated year 11, for 2 years I'd worked with a speech and language therapist, but we had a group of 10 students with various special educational needs. And they did really well. They all got their GCSE, and I felt like that was the morally right thing to do because they had the speech and language input that they needed, so they had like the specific education they needed. But listening to you talking about the inclusion, is it morally right to give special provision like a separate English class within mainstream? Is that the right thing to do, or should they be within a mixed ability class?
That's really, really useful. So thank you. Maybe we can have just a couple of responses for each question. So to start with the issue on performance and access, did anyone particularly want to answer that question? Yes.
Happily.
So Klaus and Sally.
No.
I mean, it is so, I mean, one of the things I've really been very exercised about is the concept of high-stakes assessment. And is high-stakes assessment concerned with whether these, some of the very disabled children are having a good time and showing lots of mutual support for each other on their Duke of Edinburgh's trip of a whole lot of children in wheelchairs, and to what extent is that school, a special school in this case, supporting these children to become people who have self-confidence and pride in their own achievement. The same thing applies in mainstream schools, as of course the question raised. Why are there no high-stakes achievement levels evaluated in terms of comparison between one school and another, if you're wanting to have competition? But at the moment, we do not have on Ofsted anything but a very blurred view of the broad and balanced curriculum. By and large, we get comments on achievement in the high-stakes area alone, and those are the ones that are really rewarded.
Thank you very much. Sally.
Now, I can't remember the question, but I did write down £6,000, which I think is about the schools have to pay the first £6,000. What was your question? Did that answer it?
It was about performance and access.
Access, yeah. So,
yeah,
riskier to have on the thing. Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing is that's got to stop. The school can't pay the first £6,000. That's not, especially for a smaller school, that's like a massive thing. That's really, really difficult. And then this is just how Ollie was included in football. So when they first started playing football in year 3 or whatever, Ollie really wanted to play football. Ollie wasn't very good at football. The rest of the boys were taking it very, very seriously. And so they had a system where whoever had Ollie had a goal to start. And so then they all wanted Ollie. And I think it's that simple, isn't it? Like, let's just make it attractive. And I know that the minute you say faith schools, some people start spitting, but we had such a good primary inclusion because, you know, it really is the attitude, the ethos was, there was an expectation that Ollie would contribute. And they listened. They didn't patiently wait while he spoke. They listened to what he might be saying. That was huge. His first sports day, the whole school screamed, Ollie, Ollie, Ollie. And his last sports day, nobody even looked when he ran. And that was great. That was great. So, yeah, I think there we had the attitude that came from a Christian ethos. But, you know, maybe the non-Christian schools, we just need to give them money to make them want the kids, make it a positive thing.
Tara, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I'll cover the first and last, I think. I think I don't want to say we need to go back to the time, but we need to create an accreditation and assessment process that's person-focused, that isn't just about terminal examinations. I think we need to reintroduce coursework, because certainly many of the disabled children and young people that I know that are now adults relied on that to be able to demonstrate their learning. I think we need to end the ban on facilitated communication as a method to be able to demonstrate learning. It currently is. And I think, is it about morally right? It's just, if the human right for a disabled young person is to be in mainstream school, then each subject area needs to think about how they adapt that to the diversity of pupils in that particular group. I visited Eastleigh Secondary School in Newham, about a year ago now, but they have resourced provision in Newham, so a very low number of education, health and care plans. And I was really interested, and we sat in on an English class, so I'm looking in this direction because I think that's where the question came from, where it was mixed ability, absolutely, and they were doing, The Catcher in the Rye. Didn't do that at my school. And what was interesting was to see how they created learning around that book that for some children was about reading the book and discussing the book, etc. For others, it was about thinking about American culture at the time and creating picture books around that. But they also had an additional resource within the school environment for those young people that needed additional support at particular times of the day. And I think at Eastleigh they had that every disabled child had to be in mainstream classes for at least, I think it was something like 55 or 60% of the time. But there was huge is over-dramatising it. There was a team of people within the school that were about supporting curriculum differentiation, where teachers could go and just discuss any issues they were having in changing the curriculum. And so it's about recognising the support that teachers need to feel confident to be able to teach a mixed ability class.
Thank you very much. I mean, just to build there on the extra help issue, this is a dilemma, and it's a dilemma that affects supporting needs of all young people, actually. The amount of time that you take them outside the mainstream class to have the extra help, they're obviously losing the time, often in enrichment activities or broader curriculum, modern foreign languages, etc., that some other young people take for granted. And often, if it's disadvantaged kids, disadvantaged in a range of ways, who are being the ones that are missing out on that broader curriculum, you're again perpetuating and exacerbating those cycles. So it's a genuine dilemma, I think. Nevertheless, a meaningful and real one that, of course, will affect all schools and educators, and we need to find a balance and just be constantly reflecting on that, I think. You know, it's an issue that I think has affected pupil premium practice as well, for example, with in terms of socially disadvantaged kids. Vegeta, can I ask you to come in on the what should Syncos do?
Those are the future advocates for their children when they leave education and when they leave having your support and your expertise. So personally, I think that giving them a voice that connects them to people with power at the local authority is also something that is priceless that you would do. The fact that you're listening to them, finding the time for them, knowing how busy your role is, I think is already a sign of you as a leader. But I think quite crucially, it's about the principles and the code of practice really being in action. And if they're able to feel that strength through you, they're going to learn how to take that on when you're not there, which is going to be incredibly powerful for their child when they become young people.
Thank you for that. Just before we go to the next round of questions, we've had some results from the Twitter poll. The question was, what would most improve education provision for children with SEND? And very interestingly for us at the IOE, we had 38% said more funding, 12% said incentives for inclusion, and 50% said better teacher training. So that really is an issue for us as teacher educators, I think, and certainly something that I'll be taking away from this evening. This being said, I've also been forwarded a poll comment, and this is from one contributor. It says, if you work in an inclusive school, the barrier for most is funding. If you can't provide support or resources, even the best teachers would struggle. And I suppose that this has is common sense as well. So leading on from that, more questions, and I'm going to look in this direction this time. So a gentleman here, a gentleman in the corner, and a lady at the front here. Let me see. Yeah.
Hi. I'm
Can I just add, can we keep the questions short and the responses short, and we'll get more in?
Sure.
Well?
Hi. I'm a secondary Senko. I was primary, and I help run the National Senko Forum you set up. It is about money. Sadly, say the government gives the school £5,000, and they need to put £6,000 towards a child with their plan. We've got 36 plans. The money isn't there. The government isn't even funding it to the right level. If they are putting in max of 12,000, we will put in 6. That's 18,000. Where the actual costs are £28,000. The schools are not able to provide the support needed. Therefore, all these students at SEND support level are losing out, and that is why the levels of SEN in school have dropped from 21.5% in 2010 to 14.8% now. It is provision based, it is not need, and that must change.
Okay, thanks. A comment rather than a question.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fine. Thanks for your input there. Gentleman on the end here. Yeah, this at the front. No, I think sorry, I saw a hand up. I thought. No. Okay, the lady here then.
First of all, I'd like to just comment that I don't think we should burn anything down. I think there's some amazing work going on, and I've been involved with some fantastic teachers all over.
I'm a sitcom actress, don't take me seriously.
But my question is, how far do you think actually it's an issue regarding recruitment and retention? Because I know in my work we are losing some excellent specialist teachers due to other pressures that are coming from all over. That are not necessarily anything to do with SEN, but the workload and other issues that are really forcing people out that we really need to keep, and be persuaded to use the expertise, as obviously your schools are, in networking with other colleagues a little bit more effectively.
Thank you very much. Was there one more, or shall we? This lady here.
Hello, my name's Caroline Gibbs, and I used to be a researcher here at the Institute of Education, but well over 30 years ago we were doing research on how, yes, with Klaus's help, research on how ordinary schools were managing to support Warnock's 18%, as we called them for shorthand. But I actually wanted to make a suggestion, and it's around testing and assessment. Teachers need to do testing. It's part of their professional repertoire. They need to make assessments. The problem that we're looking at, and which Klaus and Sarah mentioned, is that when those test results are used for league tables and accountability testing, that corrupts teachers' behavior, it's inevitable, and that impacts on whether children with special needs are welcome in a school. There's no God-given law that we have to have league tables. There is no God-given law that says, or even Tory party law that says, we have to be able to publish comparisons among schools. That is something that could stop. Politically very difficult, administratively very simple. But that would have tremendous beneficial impacts on what goes on in schools.
Caroline, thank you. Okay, so again, another round of good questions. Vegeta, you were last time, maybe first this time. Would you scrap league tables?
We're not on them. I think that says a lot. So this idea of segregation, we certainly feel that we create our own league table, we value everybody, and we don't allow ourselves to be measured by pretty much anything. Even the 6 outstandings don't define us. What defines us is the passion and the desire to make sure our pupils are recognized in their local community, valued, and are very much going to be contributors, and that their families know that they have no limit on their ceiling.
That's really, thank you for that. On retention, teacher retention, thoughts there?
It's a connected comment. I think it is. I think we've got to a stage now where teachers don't feel they can really ask for help, that they can say, I don't know how to do that, where can I get some help? And I think that often pushes people out of the profession. Certainly if you talk to the teaching unions, there is a sense that they are under more scrutiny than they have ever been, but without a positive outcome. And I think that's a real worry. I mean, I think league tables, I think, do I think they're a good idea or not? What worries me is that they're so narrow. They're only about academic attainment. Why don't we have a league table for the most inclusive schools, but really understand what we mean by that? And so there would have to be a great deal of work to rethink about what we mean about inclusive education. I would really encourage us to look towards Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is not UK specific. It's about a global commitment to inclusive education, because I suppose it creates the tone and the spirit of what it is we're wanting to change in our education systems, that ensure, not allow, but they ensure that all that all children, whatever their difference, background, learning style, feel part of that education system, and whatever contribution they make is valued equally.
Thank you. Please, yeah.
In 1988 Act, our dear Mr. Baker said we want to introduce competition in schools, and I said, as far as assessment was concerned, that would be lovely if it was about how flexible you are in supporting kids with special needs in your school. I was asked to be on the assessment commission for the national curriculum. I flatly refused and explained at great length to the minister concerned why I wouldn't do that.
Very good.
Can I quickly respond to this question? Sure. Just on a practical level, we can't control cost of living. So, but something that has cost our school nothing is just embedding professional learning communities, because we need to make the space for our teachers to ask those questions, to explore what the answers might be, but actually to explore that in a very professional capacity. That allows us to respond to issues like workload, which are in our control. And what I would say is that then makes the school community theirs, and they're very much owning, shaping the provision instead of having to deliver it, which I think is really important.
Thank you.
Can I just make one comment on Senkos? Sorry.
Yes, all right, very quickly on Senkos then. Go on.
No,
I'm
done.
I've got a special question for you in a minute, Sally, so go on.
It's just to, we were talking about teacher training earlier on, and one of the things we've been saying about the National Senko Forum, it is the most incredibly cheap form of further professional development through the support of Senkos of each other. And it's very much related to the work of the Centre for Inclusive Education here, which emphasizes knowledge exchange. And if there's one place where knowledge exchange goes on, it's on the Senko Forum. Sorry to plug that, but...
Very good. Thank you. Sally, I got a question through from Twitter. I don't have the... no, it's a good
Not one of those.
It says, if you get to choose between funding or attitude as a focus for improvement, which would you choose?
I choose attitude. I choose attitude. I mean, Sue Buckley, and I'm not an educator, my mother is. She's probably I'm bringing shame on the family sitting here talking about penguins. But anyway... Yeah, Sue Buckley says the best, most inclusive school she ever saw was in Cape Town, where they had not two pennies to rub together. And, you know, my son and I are failing secondary education currently. We've got split placement between mainstream and a special. It's our second mainstream. But the difference between this one and the first one is night and day. And it's all down to the Senko. So I chose the first school. I mean, I always think I only ever choose a school on a Senko. Chose the first school on the Senko, but she is sadly retired because you have to choose in year 5, and she had retired by the time we got to year 7 and was kind of not replaced, but replaced by the deputy head who's in charge of discipline. That must never happen, because those two just don't go together, do they? And so they left Ollie in a room on his own for a long time until he ran amok so many times that they expelled him. And then he went to the second school. We have this amazing angel woman Senko who I just love. Really love. And she does, I mean, most of the stuff she does is teaching the other staff how to
think about Ollie, so not to chase him when he... So Ollie tries to walk away when he gets angry and can't speak when he gets angry. And the biggest difference really is she made him a lanyard with red, yellow and green cards, which say, you know, I am feeling very stressed. I am very angry. I'm going to walk to the SEN corridor. Because otherwise we had teachers, you know, many teachers chasing him. And another thing, because Ollie has no sense of authority at all, because I'm his mother. I've made a terrible thing. I've laughed at all his jokes. I thought they were so wonderful. And I now realise I've done him a terrible disservice, because I've taught him that all people are equal and that his voice is equally respected. And this is like disastrous. But anyway, yes, yeah, when oh, I can't remember what I was saying now. But yes, it's attitude goes a long, long, long way.
And it's interesting that we haven't, despite Warnock and I think also her reflections, we haven't actually talked about language yet. And obviously that was a really key shift. And coming back to the attitudes piece, very, very important as well. We've probably got time for about 2 more questions if we keep the questions short and the responses short. So any burning ones? We have one here. Good, okay, hands were up immediately. So gentleman here and then the gentleman on the far side.
The lady over there has been burning.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, we'll squeeze 3 if we keep them nice and short.
Hi, my name's Kenny Wheeler. I work with Senkos on the National Senko Awards. One of the biggest challenges we had was actually defining inclusion. So I'm just interested on the panel's definition of inclusion and what would it look like.
Excellent, thank you. And nice and short as well. So the question here.
What does the panel think about the, I feel it's a Part 8 that happens if you can't pass GCSE in English and maths, in terms of the opportunities that then are available to you in further education?
Excellent, thank you. And sorry.
What would the panel argue that actually with the linear GCSE system, that actually children with special educational needs are going to become even less desirable to mainstream schools because that very, very high stakes end testing is something that many children with special educational needs are really going to struggle with. And they lose that opportunity to show their strengths and what they are able to demonstrate and learn.
Thank you. So 2 nicely tied together, I think. The point about high-stakes exams again and the incentives for schools to take kids with special educational needs. GCSE English and Maths and the retakes, the expectations there at present. And then definitions of inclusion. So perhaps if I could ask... let's have a think. Maybe, again, Sally, you were last time, first this time. Thinking about what does inclusion mean to you?
Can I say what it means to Nancy Gedge?
You may.
Who's an educationalist and a teacher and mother of somebody with Down syndrome. I mean, obviously, inclusion to me means what I was saying before about someone not patiently waiting while my son speaks, but actually expecting him to say something that might be worth listening to. But she wrote a great blog. Nancy Gedge is a wonderful person, very smart. Anyway, she said, it's time to put to death the idea of difference and of competition in education, because after all, we all have the same rights to it. Making provision for disabled children, no matter what that disability may look like, isn't an added extra. It is, or it should be, what we do every day. Let's call what we do what it is. Teaching. Every time we name it inclusion or integration or special or whatever, we make out that what we're doing for disabled students is different to what we're doing for everybody else. It's time to go back to the drawing board, not just with the CFA reforms, but the whole damn lot. It's time for change, and this time for the better. This time, instead of blaming individuals, let's look at, and I mean honestly look at, the constraints pushed on them by the mixed up, confused system within which we work. There's a reason why I failed to define inclusion when I wrote a book about it. Inclusion is dead. Long live education.
Thank you. Klaus, did you want to answer from your sort of historic perspective?
Well, no, actually I was going to quote Vegeta. Because one of the things you said was a school in which one can talk about growing a society with values. And I think for myself that's what you're talking about.
Excellent, thank you very much. And if I can turn to this side of the table then and ask about high stakes GCSE and the retakes. So Vegeta, you probably have a view of the retakes issue, I take it?
We have pupils who previously would have qualified for GCSEs who no longer do. And GCSEs are currency. They're a currency into the world of employment. And what we have had to do is re-educate our families into recognizing what alternative curriculums and then alternative qualifications can be. Really good schools are speaking to leaders in their local community so that they understand what that alternative qualification equals and what it means in relation to a coursework style GCSE. And we're really lucky. We're in a very inclusive local authority, so they already have an organization that's bringing those employers together. What I would say as far as the accountability side, it is down to a school's conviction to be able to state, this is the population at my school, and I'm going to give you 2 different models of data to be able to show where we would sort of rate our effectiveness, because we're challenging ourselves with those questions. And then all of the accountability that sits with Ofsted or the annual processes, they have to fit into what the school is stating is the data that is important to us. Because I think the entire panel's been very straightforward on there is so much data sitting in our system, us pulling out what's important, what is answering our question on what we do, how effective are we giving our pupils the best education they can have. Usually the picture in that data is not just going to sit with hard data. It's going to have a level of soft alongside alternative qualifications. Otherwise, we're removing an entire population in a school. And that's from working with a number of mainstream schools, not just in the special sector.
That's really helpful, thank you. And last word to you, Tara.
Oh, I've got to make a point about language, if that's all right. Also, definition for inclusion is not only the one that is in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is very clear, but I've got such a horrid memory that I'm not going to be able to repeat it for you today, but I'd be very happy to circulate the link so you can see how lovely it is. But it is what that lovely parent I talked about when I first spoke said to me in Wales, that it's about equality, belonging, value and humanity. It's feeling part of the world from the beginning. Not at some point that you reach a particular transition, but and not even from day one, from the point at which life exists. But it's a different point. Language, I think language is crucial, and I don't know whether I'm going to be the only one on the panel here that doesn't like the language of special educational needs. It suggests that it's only one group of children that have educational needs that may or may not be special, but that language is incredibly stigmatizing. All children have educational needs, whatever they might be. They may be significant at one particular point on any one particular day, but all children have educational needs. I would ditch that language immediately, because not only is it stigmatizing, it's also dehumanizing. I now hear people talking about their SEN child. I went to speak to a group of parents about 6 months ago. I never met any of the parents before, all parents of disabled kids. I said what would be great is if you just go around and say a bit about your child so that we can get a sense of them maybe being in the room. Without exception, every single parent just described to me their child's labels. I said, listen, I'm not a doctor, I have no idea what you're talking about. What I was really asking for was their name. Getting a sense of who your young person is. Labels dehumanise, whether children but also adults. So I think language is crucial, and I think I would much rather we were talking about disabled children and young people, pupils and students, and really thinking about language in terms of the social model of disability and reject the language of medicalisation.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's a...
Thank you.
That's a brilliantly sort of thought-provoking challenge to finish with, really. I think that's been hugely stimulating. There have been a lot of challenges there for us as teacher educators at the IOE, for us as researchers, lots of gaps that we could be looking at. We've had some despair and some uplifting moments, and I think a lot of hope and a lot of food for thought now as we go away and discuss on our journeys home. So thanks to you, the audience, for your great questions and for listening, and thanks so much again to our panel for their stimulating inputs. Thank you.